We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program Meg Jacobs. She is a professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University, author of multiple books. Well, I guess, yes, multiple books, I think it's fair to say, right, Meg?
Yes.
Pocketbook Politics, and co-author of Conservatives in Power. Here with us to discuss your, just this week, or I should say, it'll be next week or last week, released Panic at the Pump, the Energy Crisis and the Transformation of American Politics in the 1970s. Meg Jacobs, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Sam.
So, all right, Meg, this is just sort of the synopsis here is we are looking at the politics through the lens of the two major oil shocks, and just broadly speaking, the energy crisis and the lack, I guess, on some level, of an energy policy. And you describe, I mean, it covers the sort of the gamut. There's multiple reactions to the energy crisis. And in some ways, I mean, I guess it's fair to say that George Herbert Walker Bush, sort of the bookends of this, right? From the time he runs for Congress to the time that he invades Kuwait. Tell us about him as a central figure through this.
The story starts even earlier with him graduating from Yale and deciding he doesn't want to take the job that he's been given in investment banking on Wall Street through his family, so he's going to pack up his Studebaker and move his family out west in search of oil and the American dream in 1948. And this is a boom time in oil, so that really bookends, as you said, the book, starting with him in search of oil out in Texas, and the book ends in 1991, sending American troops into the Persian Gulf, also in search of oil once again.
And so, I mean, is that why that figure? Just because he bookends it so comfortably, or was there sort of a quality about him which captured it?
There's a couple of reasons. One, I would say maybe the most interesting reason is we've forgotten a whole cast of characters as we try to explain not only energy policy but broadly American politics from the 1970s through today. When we talk about the rise of conservatism, we look often at grassroots movements, sort of the social conservatives. In fact, it was insiders in Washington, conservative insiders in Washington, who were really key to shifting the Republican Party and the country at large to the right. And George Bush is a wonderful example of this. So his father is a senator. He himself runs for Congress in the 1960s from Texas, and he's part of a whole cohort of what I call these Washington insiders who really understand how government works and try to dismantle and take it apart from the inside out. So that's one reason why he's so interesting. And I argue in the book that in this dismantling process, energy really turns out to be a key event, something that often we know sort of in a textbook way, 1973 was a pivot moment with the first oil shock, but I really try to show its centrality in the shift to the right in American politics.
Yeah, I mean, you really do get a sense from the book of how much is incumbent upon, and I guess this is the point too, is that up to the early 70s, we had taken cheap energy as a total given at that point, right? I mean, once it starts getting squeezed, I mean, there's so much around this because, I'm a huge fan of 3 Days of the Condor, which it was one of the things that just sort of kept resonating for me in the background because, of course, and the idea that it was that George Bush, on some level, his relationships that he was building as an oil man were the source of his power and throughout all the different positions he had in government. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, he trains himself to be an oil man. He's not. You see, even when he first runs for president, is on the vice ticket in 1980 and then runs on his own in 1988. He is, in many ways, the country club Republican, but really he's cut his teeth in Texas politics, and no one works harder than he does to bring Texas into the Republican fold, something that had not been seen as even a remote possibility when he first moves there in the 1940s. And it's through sort of oil and the connections he forges. This is when he meets James Baker, Robert Mosbacher. I mean, they're all sort of attempting to shift the South towards the GOP, and oil is really sort of formative in this way. Their argument is really simple. If you want less regulation, then the Republican Party is your answer, and they sell themselves that way.
And that is essentially the sort of the, I mean, that's when the idea of less regulation was directly tied into the idea that you're stifling business. Whereas now, I mean, maybe there's a bit of an exaggeration, but I feel like now it is almost just sort of a box that is checked off for identity politics. I mean, and that is something that I found really fascinating about your book because, obviously I remember the first oil embargo, but only as, in part because it just so happens, like, I remember where we got our gas, and I remember it was Dudley Esso, and I remember distinctly being in line at Dudley Esso. We had our car parked, and there was like 4 or 5 cars ahead of us and like 5 or 6 cars behind us. And I think it just resonated with me because I played on that minor league baseball team. But there was so much going on at that time. Let's start with some of those figures that we may have forgotten. What I found really interesting, let's start with Scoop Jackson, Henry Jackson, was how much, I mean, I think it just sort of resonated. I mean, I think I was always vaguely knew where his positions were on the Cold War and that he was a New Dealer, but there was something about seeing it in the context of oil, which, and energy, made me think that maybe part of his sort of a sense of being a real New Deal Democrat was a function of staving off the Soviet Union. I mean,
this is a case. I mean, especially, he is the figure in this where his sort of hawkish foreign policy views, in fact, reinforce his liberal domestic agenda. He's so concerned about becoming dependent on insecure sources from the Middle East and how that will sort of affect standings with the Soviet Union that he pushes for a big campaign to regulate consumption and equalize it in the United States, and sort of push for what he sees as an Apollo project, a Manhattan project for alternative energies, and he pushes them really hard. And what's interesting, and you've put your finger on it, is this sort of way in which energy is really right at the heart of these alternative worldviews, a sort of liberal New Deal worldview where the solution to any crisis is more regulation. So one of the things that Scoop Jackson wants to do, which is impossible to think of now, is roll back prices at the pump as they start to increase. He wants to put rationing into place so everyone can get their fair share. And on the other side are these conservatives who are actually in the Nixon administration in 1973 during the embargo, who see this as a disaster. So you end up with one of the great ironies that the first energy czar we have is William Simon, who, is one of the most conservative ideologues in Washington and in the last, few decades. And here he is sort of from the center of power in charge of deciding whether the Daytona 500, should be 450 instead. And it's these kind of decisions that he's forced to make, even as he's certain that any interference with the market is making the problem worse.
Yeah, I want to belabor this point because the concept, I think, that we have a well-regarded, and regardless of where your politics are, this was a serious proposal that was being argued on its merits rather than some type of Red Scare. The idea of price controls, the idea of rationing.
Well, they really existed. I mean, Nixon, who's ever the opportunist, he's put in place all these environmental policies, but the most celebrated thing that he does, the least sort of expected thing that you would anticipate this conservative Republican to do, is to put in place across-the-board wage and price controls, which he does in 1971 because he's eager to control inflation before his reelection campaign, so this way he'll be able to stimulate the economy and avoid a recession. So he puts these in place. His advisors understand the politics, but they're horrified by this. I think Schultz says it'll be easy to march in but impossible to march out, and sort of compares it to Vietnam. And they're not wrong, so that by the time 73 comes along, we're in this situation where we're increasingly dependent on imports. Imports increase like 3 times over in the early 1970s, and yet we are, quote unquote, stifling American producers because there's price controls in place. So they're the ones, actually, the American producers, the American Petroleum Institute, that they're the ones who first actually talk about an energy crisis even before the Arab embargo. And they say, listen, if you want to keep living the lifestyle that you're living, that you've been this wonderful post-war lifestyle with, driving around in your living room on wheels, you got to free the market. And the fight actually even begins before the Arab embargo.
Now, is that a function of their understanding that we had basically, in terms of American production, and we should go back here, and remind people that as late as the late 60s and I think the early 70s, the United States was the biggest oil producer in the country, the world. Right. And we had reached what was, I guess was, and this was not unpredicted and certainly not unknowable, but basically peak oil, which was, for the United States, which was, right. We've reached the limit of being able to extract oil at the cost that we were used to paying for it.
Well, the last part is incredibly important, at the cost that we were willing to pay. So the peak production comes in 1970. It's anticipated by business in the sense that they say, we're going to have to go to harsher and more remote locales, and that's going to cost more money, and we're going to have to charge more money. And they are up against a liberal Congress, people like Scoop Jackson, people like Ted Kennedy, people like Tip O'Neill, who say, we want the same deal we've always had, lots of oil, and we don't want to pay a lot for it. And so that's the sort of fight that's going on. And part of the image of the oil industry, part of this also is about a really sort of anti-oil perception among the American public. 1969, 2 weeks into Richard Nixon's time in office, is what is at the time the biggest oil spill off the coast of Santa Barbara.
Right.
And this helps to sort of jumpstart the environmental movement, so that Nixon signs at the beginning of 1970, the sweeping Environmental Policy Act, which would be impossible to imagine Congress today passing something equivalent. It has all this grandiose language of, man and earth need to coexist, and we can. And there was very much the belief by liberals that you could. Businessmen had a different point of view, that there needed to be sort of trade-offs.
And why do you think it was possible that, and this, this sort of runs throughout the entire book, I think, on some level, is this, there were a lot more, the range of potential solutions seems to me much wider than anything that we discussed today. And perhaps maybe it's a function of the problem. Everybody seemed to agree on what the problem was on some level. Is that accurate or no?
Well, it depends how you define it. For the majority of people, the problem was not enough. and not enough at prices to be paid. There were environmentalists who said, that's not the problem. The problem is that we simply use too much, right? And that sort of point of view was just beginning to emerge. But there was the perception that, well, we could regulate pollution. So there were some people, who the small is beautiful argument. There was an alternative point of view, but the sort of heart of American politics, and maybe this is still true today too, Sam, is we want to continue living our consumer lifestyles, and we don't want to pay too much for it.
And that was, and just to bring this back again, is the 3 days of the Condor. I mean, that is what the Cliff Robertson says to Robert Redford. See how they act when they don't have enough of their oil, basically, and justifying everything he did. And at one point, was it Ehrlichman saying this to James Akins, or I can't remember exactly where it was, but Ehrlichman, one of Nixon's domestic
about conservation.
Yes, tell us that quote.
Conservation is not a Republican ethic. I think that's the one that you're talking
yes,
about.
And we've heard that. I feel like Cheney said something to that effect, like 20 years later, 30 years later.
Yes, right. And that's the point of view. So what's interesting is Nixon switches his tune. It's not that he embraces conservation, but he sees voluntary conservation as the lesser of two evils. Because as soon as you have the gas lines, there's all this tremendous push. Well, let's divide it up equally. It's impossible for us to imagine today, but rationing actually fell only 8 votes short in the Senate and sort of had this long life all the way lasting throughout the whole decade, so that in fact flashing forward, Ted Kennedy, when he runs in 1980, one of the things he promises is rationing for gasoline, because everyone thinks, okay, well, I'll just get my fair share. Nixon and Ehrlichman and all of the guys around him see this is going to be a disaster. So this is when they do things like they trot out Snoopy. They place him they have him depicted on the top of his doghouse, taking a nap with a bubble above it, I believe in conservation. So they have all of these appeals to voluntary conservation, and the energy companies get in on this too. So Amoco, who had Johnny Cash as a spokesman, sort of, the idea of the open road, all that, they pulled those commercials, and instead you have Johnny Cash urging Americans to drive less and conserve.
Explain this.
George C. Scott sort of urging people, don't be fuelish. That was the other big campaign. And these were sort of pushes to voluntarism as a way of sort of avoiding more heavy-handed government solutions.
So they basically said, like, this is a personal responsibility type of issue, right? As opposed to something that government policy should deal with. Just tell people how, if the rationing had gone in, how would people get it? They go to the post office and get tickets, or everybody gets mailed one?
Exactly. You would have to go get your ration book. It would be a monthly supply. The big thing, and they were under so much pressure that they actually printed up ration booklets, later only to discover that they looked too much like a $1 bill and could be used in a change machine. So they had to keep them under lock and key. If they were going to be forced to use them, Nixon's people said, and this was really sort of William Simon and Herbert Stein and George Shultz, if they were going to be forced to use them, they preferred what they called a white market in coupons, so unlike World War II. And, someone like Nixon, his first job in Washington was working in the Office of Price Administration, overseeing rationing for tires. If they were going to be forced to use them, they were going to allow people to trade them for money, as opposed to sort of a black market, which kind of defeats the point of them. But, it was a way of sort of simulating the marketplace, so that their idea was, well, if you let prices go up, because they're under price control still at this point, that would sort of inevitably clear the market and end the gas lines. I think one thing that we underestimate, this is moving the story a little bit forward, but one thing that we underestimate is sort of the intensity of the gas lines, and how much Americans sort of thought that the existence of gas lines both meant sort of the end of the world as they knew it and a sort of breach of the social contract. This was government deeply failing to take care of them.
I think because I remember so little, I feel like, from my childhood. And I must have been 7, maybe 8, I think, when when I was sitting in Dudley Esso gas line. And I remember like it being a big deal. I mean, I don't, I mean, just remember it being in the gas line, and I remember there being anger. And I mean, it's tough to divorce that necessarily for what was going on at home at times, but I remember, but I do remember that. I mean, that is what I remember. I remember there being like just frustration that I couldn't quite.
So do you remember the 73, 74? Do you remember the?
No, I remember 73, 74. By 79, I was, I was riding a bike. That was not an issue for me. But I remember because I was because my minor league baseball team when I was like 7 or whatever it was Dudley Esso, and so that's
there
why
you were as a little kid sitting without a seatbelt in the front seat. So in other ways, things have changed.
Yes, I think we used to go in the way back because that was more fun. We had one of those like Plymouth Furies, and Dudley would come out, and it was. It was actually sort of fun, but it was weird. I do remember it being very strange. And what is clear from your book is that it had an impact on a multitude of things that were going on. Like I never realized it was so close to Watergate in terms of all this stuff is happening. There must have been a total siege mentality at the White House that was, I mean, it's arguable as to which was bigger at the time for a lot.
Well, I mean, this was perhaps self-serving, but Nixon and his advisors around him believed that the energy crisis was bigger, and maybe that was self-serving because they believed they could do something about it.
Right.
But the polls showed this too. So one of the top pollsters, reported repeatedly to the White House that people cared more about the gas lines than about Watergate. And even to Scoop Jackson, and this animated him too, people writing in letters saying, please rename the Watergate investigation committees to, the energy crisis committees, and let's get to the bottom of this problem. There was a tremendous amount of anger because for a couple of reasons. One is that even though these were precipitated by foreign events, Americans believed that they were the result of big oil conspiracy. This was sort of, they were certain that energy companies were holding gasoline off the market to try to get rid of price controls and raise the prices again. They were certain about this, and they were certain that the president was letting them get away with it. And so there was tremendous anger. And somebody like Scoop Jackson, who had his own presidential ambitions, played to this. So in January 1974, when Congress, after Congress has recessed and everyone goes home for the recess and sees how angry people are because you have all of the Christmas trees without lights and everyone Christmas is ruined in 1973 because you can't use electricity, and they come back and Scoop Jackson holds these televised hearings where he calls the executives from all the big oil companies to Washington. He has them sit impaneled behind a table in the same room actually as the Watergate hearings, and he accuses them of what he calls obscene profits. And he takes them apart. And this was a popular thing for him to do, even if it didn't really produce any more gas or alleviate the lines.
And there was such pressure that Nixon, during his State of the Union address in January of 74, basically lied, right, about and we should tell people what we have to sort of, I mean, I think most people know, but maybe younger folks don't, of why there was this oil shock. I mean, we were headed towards a squeeze, it seems to me, but then we got to a sort of like a cliff, right? And the cliff was what?
Well, I mean, you had this sort of perfect storm developing because, as you say, there's a squeeze, sort of rising demand, lessening supply, increasing reliance on imports, and the leaders of the OPEC countries understood this. So you have someone like Gaddafi in Libya and even Saudi Arabia, our ally, warning the United States that they might need to unsheath the oil weapon if they're not more cooperative in their support of Israel. And in fact, what happens is in October, and this is where the timing does track very well with Watergate, in October, when Egypt and Syria invade Israel in the Yom Kippur War, and the United States supports Israel, this is what then triggered OPEC to institute an embargo. And even more than the embargo, led by Saudi Arabia, which was the biggest producer then, as is now in the region, decides to massively cut back its production. So it changes the whole global oil market and leads to a reduction in supply. So that's what's precipitating event was.
And we should also say that at that point, the U.S. in support of Israel was very much a part and parcel of the Cold War. I mean, this was,
Absolutely.
I mean, in a way that obviously I think, people under the age of 30 don't necessarily understand today.
Yeah, so Nixon's sort of caught because Kissinger is his guy there. This is when he starts his famous shuttle diplomacy, and he arranges Kissinger a ceasefire, but he can't get an end to the embargo. And Nixon's kind of caught because Kissinger's telling him, stop talking about the embargo because that's just going to make us look weak and they're going to use it even more. And we need to sort of figure out how we're going to make sure that we're in control of these negotiations more than the Soviets. But Nixon is desperate to get more gas to the gas stations. And so it's this sort of desire and impulse to address an immediate, what he saw as sort of gut level problem that we're pretty close to doing something about the embargo, which was completely not true. Kissinger was furious at him, and in fact.
Hi, I'm Sam Seder, and this is an Ann Coulter doll.
You should not be immigrating here. Yeah. Stay in your country and hate us.
For smart progressive talk and a little bit of this and even a little bit of that.
Mission accomplished.
Subscribe to our podcast, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and like us on Facebook to get some of our best video clips.